Walk down the aisles of a supermarket, scroll through Amazon, or if you still live in the 90s, browse the storefronts inside a shopping mall, and you'll be bombarded by product after product. We're surrounded by material items that have become part of the fabric of our consumerist society. But a lot of these items were created for entirely different purposes than what we use them for today. Welcome back to Weirdly Interesting. From Nazi coffee to the connection between black holes and Wi-Fi, here are some of the strangest origin stories of everyday things. Wi-Fi and black holes. What would our world be like without Wi-Fi? It's probably how a lot of you are watching this video right now. Well, if it wasn't for a physicist trying to prove Stephen Hawking's theory about black holes, we may very well be living in a world full of Ethernet cables and that horrible dial-up tone that tortured the ears of those old enough to remember it as they logged onto America Online. Back in 1974, Stephen Hawking predicted that there were tiny little black holes scattered throughout the universe. These black holes were supposed to be about the size of a proton and would pop into and out of existence all the time, either evaporating or exploding. When they did this, these mini black holes would emit a faint radio signal. When an Australian radio astronomer named Dr. John O'Sullivan learned about Hawking's hypothesis, he set out to try and find these faint radio emissions. This was no small task. The universe is buzzing with all kinds of noise, and ultimately, O'Sullivan and his team had to call it quits. Finding such tiny, hushed tones in such a vast universe was too difficult. But while they were at it, O'Sullivan developed an algorithm that turned out to have a pretty revolutionary application. By 1992, the lab where O'Sullivan worked was looking to commercialize certain aspects of the radio astronomy research. It turned out that O'Sullivan's equation was perfect for helping cut down on all the radio noise that made wireless networks impossible before. In 1999, Wi-Fi was born, thanks in large part to Stephen Hawking and his theory about tiny black holes. Bowling started as a religious ceremony. Who doesn't like a good game of 10-pin? From people like the dude from the Big Lebowski, bowling can be an almost religious experience. And in fact, it has its roots in a very heavy, deeply meaningful religious ceremony that goes back millennia. There's actually some evidence that the Egyptians played a game similar to bowling. And if so, the game's roots can be traced back to as early as 5200 BC. The Egyptian version is considered by Egyptologists to be more of a child's game. 9 pins on a ball were found in a child's tomb in Nakkada, Egypt, and various wall paintings depict similar versions of the game. Roman legionnaires apparently played a version of bacci, or Italian lawn bowling, to pass the time between battles. But the closest thing we have to modern bowling probably originated in the 3rd or 4th century AD in Germany. Early Christian churchgoers would apparently play the game as a religious ritual. In it, the pins represented heathen sinners. If a parishioner bowled a strike and knocked down all the pins at once, they would be cleansed of all their sins. A bit more fun than going to confession or hitting yourself on the back. Torturous treadmills. Go to any gym nowadays and you'll find a line of treadmills with people running while listening to music or watching something on the little screens, often embedded in the dashboards. And yes, for some people, running may seem like torture. But the treadmill was originally intended for exactly that, and not in a way that was intended to be good for your cardiovascular health. Back in 1880, an English civil engineer named William Cubitt designed the world's first treadmill, which was originally called a tread wheel. It looked a lot like a cylindrical hamster wheel and became widely used around English prisons as a way to punish prisoners while also grinding grain or pumping water. By 1842, they were being used in more than 100 jails across the UK. As many as 20 prisoners could walk on the treadmill at a time as a punishment for bad behavior, and they were often forced to walk on the tormented industrial machines for upwards of 10 hours at a time. The practice was thought at the time to help rehabilitate prisoners and give them more discipline. But the treadmills often became more sadistic machines than useful devices for instilling a good Christian work ethic. A few treadmills even made their way over to the United States. The painful, monotonous, and exhaustion-inducing device didn't last too long. By 1901, the number of them used in prisons had dwindled to just 13. Nazi coffee. According to one legend, coffee was first discovered in Ethiopia in the 9th century after a goat herder noticed that some members of his flock were dancing apparently so excited after eating the bean that they would prance around manically. The story is a good one, but might just be a myth. The first credible evidence we have about the origins of coffee comes from 15th century Yemen. The origins of decaf coffee are far more recent and far more sinister. The decaffeinated version of the brew was first discovered in 1905 by a German man named Ludwig Roselius. Roselius figured out how to take the caffeine out by accident after a shipment of beans came his way after being flooded by seawater. After some experimentation, Roselius realized that he had a perfectly decaffeinated brew, a fact he was pleased with because his father had apparently drank himself to death via over-caffeination, a story that may or may not hold water. Either way, Roselius decaf coffee was a hit in Germany. His company, Café Hague, was advertised as a healthy alternative to the heart-pounding effects of its caffeinated cousin. Some years went by, and then this failed artist with a tiny moustache and a big voice seized power and began screaming about the virtues of the Aryan race and how everyone else should pretty much die. For Hitler and the Nazis, Roselius Decaf Blend was a perfect way to keep the Aryan race healthy and virile. Roselius himself was a sympathizer to the Aryan cause. The whole thing stemmed from a movement from the 20s called Lebensreform, or life reform, which included a diet that swore off stuff like stimulants, high-proof alcohol, tobacco, and refined sugar. Yet for some reason the Nazis loved to give their people crank-spiked chocolates. Yet another senseless contradiction in one of the darkest episodes in European history. Mexican dictator popularized chewing gum. Chewing gum seems like a mundane enough thing at first, until you realize the bizarre story behind its origins, one that involved the chance meeting between an exiled Mexican president and a glassmaker on, of all places, Staten Island, New York. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna led a colorful life. He was a key figure in Mexico's War of Independence against Spain in the early 1800s. He was the Mexican commander leading the way in the infamous Battle of the Alamo. He eventually became president with a leadership style that could usually be described as dictatorial. He left and returned to office a whopping 11 times and was eventually overthrown during the Revolution of Ayutla in the mid-1850s and forced into exile. Santa Anna was persuaded by a deceitful confidant that he should travel to New York, where he was told he'd find the funds to raise an army and return to Mexico to reclaim power. It was all a lie, though. Santa Anna got to Staten Island and realized he needed to find another way to raise the money. One of the few things Santa Anna brought to the States with him was a generous supply of chicle, a chewy sap from the sapodilla tree that was popular in Mexico. When he met an inventor named Thomas Adams, Santa Anna tried to convince him that they could make a fortune by replacing rubber with chicle to make stuff like tires and blimps. Adams tried and tried, but he couldn't figure out how to get the chicle strong enough to have any real industrial use. What he did figure out, though, was how to turn it into chewing gum. Adams would go on to make a fortune, founding the American Chicle Company, maker of chiclets and eventually Dentyne. Unfortunately, Santa Anna didn't make a penny. He eventually returned to Mexico, crippled and nearly blind from cataracts. He received a full pardon, though, and died with full military honors at the ripe old age of 82. Balloon animals and the Aztecs. Clowns are creepy, sure, but human offerings are creepier. The Aztecs were notorious for their horribly prolific penchant for offering people to the gods in order to make sure the sun keeps rising every morning. The Aztecs also had an admittedly less horrific but still weird type of ritual that gave us the modern-day balloon animals you can find clowns twisting up at carnivals. Part of the Aztecs' way to appease the gods, particularly Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, involved animal offerings. One of these rituals involved cleaning out the animal's intestine, bladders, and stomachs, drying them out, sewing them together, and then twisting them into animal form much like a circus clown twists the balloon into a cat or a dog, or whatever else the wide-eyed kids looking on ask them to make. Unlike circus clowns, though, the Aztecs would then set their balloons on fire in a blaze of ritualistic glory, not exactly something children would giggle about. What other strange origins of everyday things do you know about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more weirdly interesting content.